It's been a number of years since I was here for an event, and it's good to be back. And I'm glad to be among kindred spirits as well as some old friends. Sam and Janie are here. Sam and I go back at least, 47 years or so, 48 now. And Karen and I participated in Janie and Sam's wedding. And also, we also have our friend Tina, who we have gotten to know through Sam and Janie. And I also was honored to be the pastor of Leon and Lou Claymore when they sojourned among us at Oakhurst Baptist Church, and I consider them now my friends. And I'm grateful to Stell Simonton, who I understand was down in the back today, and we're both disappointed she couldn't be here because she's the one that listened to a sermon I preached in Washington, D.C. A few months ago upon the occasion of my 40th anniversary of my ordination in that congregation. And Stell thought that my sermon welcoming belief and unbelief in ourselves and with others might be an interesting topic for this congregation. And I think somebody's already got my sermon started on the piano there. So I'm grateful for that. My mama was a Free Will Baptist of the Pentecostal variety. An early memory I have of the church services was when a deacon would begin praying, a lone voice, quietly, almost inaudibly from a pew. I could hear what he was saying, but then another voice would start. Then another would chime in, and another, women's voices joining the men's, the fervor growing stronger. It would build into a cacophony of noise, prayers, blending and mixing. As a child, I felt strangely ambivalent about all this. On the one hand, there was a sense of unity, what I would now call community. The worship was exciting, energizing, and even amazing to my young mind. But at the same time, I found myself not feeling quite a part of it, as if a game was being played and I did not know the rules. Once when I was about 7 years old, while my mother was all caught up in the praying and shouting, I slipped unnoticed out the door. Across the street was a well. The folks living there allowed church members to drink from it. But that night, the house was dark and the well was dimly lit from the street lights. I lowered the bucket and heard it splash, excited and a little scared about doing something a child was not allowed to do without an adult to supervise. My mother would have been rightly upset, for indeed there was danger. I turned the handle and wound the rope, peering into the dark hole all the while. At last, the bucket rose magically into the dim light, and I could see the water reflecting. I pulled it all the way up. I poured the water into the common tin cup hanging on a nail. I took a deep drink and still remember vividly the cold, delicious taste. I filled my cup up again and went across the street. But instead of going into the church, I sat on the hood of a car. Inside the stained glass windows, I could hear the excitement, or did it sound like commotion? Outside, I enjoyed the cool breeze of the night air on my skin and the satisfying taste of the fresh well water. I could sense a longing, but I was not sure if it could be if it could be satisfied inside the church or outside the church. Or maybe the answer to my longing lay in the bottom of the mysterious well with its capacity to quench. I was on a pilgrimage that evening that continues to this day at 71. And each of you is on a pilgrimage too. On a pilgrimage, you experience things you never imagined, but there are also humdrum days when nothing unusual seems to happen. There are experiences that once amazed you, but now are lost in memory. And there are insignificant things that you can vividly recall. There are moments that changed your life. Sometimes you realize that immediately, and other times it would be years or decades before you comprehend what happened. In my 40s, while speaking with a psychologist as part of a career assessment, I mentioned being the oldest of 4 children. Then he pointed out on a form I had filled out that I had a brother who died 13 months before I was born. As we talked, he pointed out that my parents had tried again and were able to get pregnant just 4 months after the devastating loss of a baby. The psychologist startled me when he said, "You were conceived in grief." As a pastor, there was nothing more difficult and tragic than the loss of a child. On my mama's dresser was always a framed picture of my older brother Frankie with the only shoes he ever wore cast in bronze. I have a brother 2 years younger and 2 sisters. My parents lost another baby, Timothy Mark, between the girls. He died at birth. Neither of my parents ever drove a car. An early memory I have is walking with our family on Easter Sunday to put flowers on the babies' graves, which I now see as a sacred pilgrimage within my pilgrimage. The picture of Frankie with the bronze shoes sits on my dresser now. It was the one thing I asked my siblings if I could have when my mother died. Both my parents' ashes are buried on the little gravesite with their babies. This past week, I went back to a job I had before COVID ended, the job as a part-time on-call hospice chaplain. Usually when I mention being a hospice chaplain, people say something like, "I don't know how you could do that." But I find it very meaningful and even natural, perhaps because I was conceived in grief. This spring, I was involved in the dedication of a monument and a museum exhibit in Morganton, North Carolina, honoring mill workers like my daddy, who was illiterate and probably developmentally disabled, but worked hard taking care of his family for minimum wages, no benefits, and oppressive conditions until it broke his body and his spirit. My journey away from and back to my father has been a major theme in my pilgrimage, and I have long ago made my peace with him, or so I thought. I was surprised at the emotions this dedication arose in me, mostly a deeper appreciation of the heroic sacrifices he made for our family. That led to a pilgrimage a couple of months later, about 7 weeks ago, to the grounds of Dorothea Dix Mental Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, now a park. It had been 50 years since the one time I visited my father in that hospital. I walked the beautiful campus with a friend of a friend who I recently met, who had dedicated 3 decades in the psychiatric department of Dorothea Dix Mental Hospital. Steve helped me imagine what my father's life might have been. I went back to the park next day alone to reflect on our pilgrimages, my dad's and I, apart and together. I also visited the grave of Flora DeWitt, the grandmother of Kathy, my longtime hairdresser. Like hundreds of others, the grave lists only her name and the date she died, January 29th, 1943. Our pilgrimages often cross in unexpected ways. William Faulkner said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." In a speech on race relations, President Obama paraphrased it, "The past isn't dead and buried. In fact, it isn't even past." Though there is a white lash going on in our country to try to hide our racist past, I find it hopeful that congregations like yours are committed to understanding our past in the hope of creating a more just future, expressed in your statement of solidarity, Black Lives Matter, and in your biracial history project, which was, the pictures are available about that. Educating yourselves in the community while doing restorative justice work. Your congregation is on a pilgrimage too. Oakhurst Baptist Church, where I was pastor for 28 years, beginning in 1989, was on a pilgrimage long before I arrived, beginning in 1913. In the 50s, they were declared the Church of the Year by the Southern Baptist Church Growth Department. By the early 70s, some local Baptists wanted to expel them, when the church was among the first churches in the Atlanta area to racially integrate. Among other ways Oakhurst was first was, particularly among Baptists, was ordaining women deacons, ordaining women to the ministry, becoming an open and affirming congregation, ordaining gay persons to the ministry, and having a gay minister on staff. This got the attention of the Georgia Baptist Convention, and they approved a constitutional change in 1998, stating that a cooperating church does not include one which knowingly takes or has taken any action to affirm, approve, or endorse homosexual behavior. When I met with their leaders, I tried to tell them, as far as I could see, our gay members have a very similar behavior compared to our heterosexual members. But they did not find that as humorous as I did. They may not have found it as funny if they realized who the person was who accompanied me to the annual convention to meet with the leaders the morning of the vote to oust us. I introduced correctly as my companion Jack Smith as one of our deacons. Jack insisted on acting like an assistant, an administrative assistant, such as I had never had before or since. He drove me around, opened doors for me, carried a briefcase, which was largely a prop, shaking hands with all the leaders. Jack Smith was an openly gay man who was HIV positive. As a minister over 5 decades in church youth ministry, campus ministry in the church, one of the most meaningful parts is always joining my pilgrimage with others, such as Jack. One of my first pastoral visits after I began as Oakhurst pastor was with Jack and his wife Jane after they lost their only son, their beloved Mark, in a car wreck when he was 19. But I also have many memories of belly laughing with Jack and special memories of going back with him to Rising Star, Texas, his hometown that his ancestors settled by wagon train in 1875, and meeting his father still living in his childhood home and other beloved relatives. 2 years after Jack was my attaché, along with 2 of other Jack's friends, we returned to Rising Star, to the cemetery beside the little Baptist church where generations of his family had served, and spread Jack's ashes over the graves of his ancestors, following an intricate handmade map he made for us, with the last of the ashes poured on Mark's grave. And with a sudden gust of wind, we also had Jack all over us, even in our eyelashes. I have found that each of us has somebody else's pilgrimages all over us. We have each other's pilgrimages all over us. I once planned a service led by Oakhurst members who had lost a child when we declared Oakhurst a no-closure zone for grieving. I also miss pastoring a church where a wide spectrum of belief within us and within others was welcomed. Around 2004, my pilgrimage shifted dramatically again. I was graced by an invitation to join an equal number of Atlanta area Muslims, Christians, and Jews on a pilgrimage, not a trip. We were told never to call it a trip. A pilgrimage to Turkey, which was chosen because a long history of people from different faiths living amongst each other in relative harmony. Turkey also contains some important holy sites and places of worship from all 3 traditions. We spent each day with a person of another faith, and along the way we each shared our spiritual journeys with the whole group. On the 8th day of our time together, we were in Ephesus. At the end of a long day, we stopped at a mosque so the Muslims could have evening prayer. Most of the mosques we had visited did not allow non-Muslims in during prayer time. But the imam of this mosque invited us all in to this beautiful 600-year-old mosque built with marble from the ruins of a Roman temple to Diana. Upon entering, I had the urge to join the prayer line, but was not sure I should. So I walked to the side section where the non-Muslims were gathering. Then I looked and had to do a double take when I realized that 2 of the Jewish men had joined the prayer line. In the section for the Muslim women to pray were also Jewish and Christian women. I joined the prayer line, and another Christian also did. I did not know the Arabic words, but I could follow the movements of the Muslims beside me. I found it deeply moving and still do when I pray in a mosque. Word had gotten out in the little village that a busload of people had stopped at the mosque and a group gathered outside. One of the local men who had come for prayers while his little girl played on the floor behind us went out and explained that a group of Muslims and Jews and Christians had just prayed together inside their mosque. So we came out to see looks of surprise, even shock. Some of them began to cry. We were told they cried because they could never imagine such a thing would be possible. They had experienced a miracle because Muslims, Jews, and Christians had prayed together inside their village mosque. I returned home and committed myself to interfaith relations, which changed my doctor of ministry program at Columbia Presbyterian Seminary. The final title was Pastor and People, an Interfaith Pilgrimage. I declared in the intro, not many issues are more pertinent in our day than the relationship of Christian congregation with people of other faiths. This paper tells the story of an interfaith pilgrimage between a pastor and his people that transformed them all. It offers guidance and a model of how churches can be part of the solution instead of the problem in interfaith relations. It demonstrates how a congregation's involvement in interfaith relationships can deepen one's own Christian faith. Years later, I'll be a part of an interfaith pilgrimage to Israel. In my first year of retirement, helped lead a groundbreaking interfaith pilgrimage to Cuba. This afternoon, I will be joining a friend I made on that Cuba pilgrimage, Gareth Young, a Buddhist, as part of a ceremony installing him as the first guiding teacher of Red Clay Sangha in Chambly. Near the end of my final paper, I turned to Matthew Fox, who had a big influence on me with his creation spirituality, and on a week-long retreat on the passionate life. Fox believes that we desperately need in our day a deep ecumenism and writes, I begin with an observation by Meister Eckhart, who says that divinity is an underground river that no one can stop and no one can dam up. Fox continues, there is one underground river, but there are many wells into that river, an African well, a Taoist well, a Buddhist well, a Jewish well, a Muslim well, a goddess well, a Christian well, Aboriginal wells. Many wells, but one river. To go down a well is to practice a tradition, but we could make a brave mistake, an idolatrous one, if we confuse the well itself with the flowing waters of the underground river. Many wells, one river. I'm still wondering what mysterious well I am peering down in my life now, and perhaps which one I'm crawling back out of. With so many Baptists and other Christians going down the well of Christian nationalism and hatred of anybody they see as other, following a false savior, I realize that this is not my tribe anymore. But I always carry with me those traditions along the way. I once preached for a church asking if they could share our church building. They were Chin refugees from Myanmar, descendants of Baptists going back to the early 1900s who have been heavily persecuted, especially since the military coup in 2001. I found out later that the pastor of the church had been brutally tortured before escaping and finding his way through an Indonesian refugee camp to the United States. They were packed in a room at a restaurant with the smell of Chinese food permeating the air, where I was welcomed by the leaders and a young woman who would be translating. I was still quite nervous. Before I preached, there was to be a time of prayer. A man, praying in his Chin language, began to pray. And to my surprise, another man joined in, beginning quietly. Others, almost inaudibly, began to pray. Women and even children joining in, the fervor growing stronger. It built into a cacophony of prayers, blending and mixing. I joined them fervently and joyfully, praying aloud myself. When it was finished, it was time for me to speak. And I told them I'd not been in a church praying like that since I was a small child. And so I felt myself at home. I went back to Oakhurst and proposed asking our church to share our building with them. to which they unanimously agreed, having a long history of helping welcome and resettle refugees going back to the 1950s. And so the Chin Church, the Chin Baptist Church, became a special part of my pilgrimage in my last years as pastor of Oakhurst. Even at my age, I'm not certain which well I am peering into or crawling out of. For now, I see myself as a person of Baptist Christian tradition, committed to interfaith relationships on a spiritual pilgrimage, or sometimes just on a pilgrimage. Most days, or some part of every day, my thirst is quenched by mysterious living water from a deep source, at times alone with friends and family, sometimes in church, and sometimes with communities like this. Today I invite you to reflect back on your pilgrimage and what has brought you here. Which wells are you peering into these days or crawling out of? As a pastor, I saw my sermons not as a word from God, but conversation starters for the community to reflect on their own faith journey. We each add our own story as a vital piece of the fabric that is God's holy quilt, more beautiful and mysterious than imaginable. I've come to believe that faith is a pilgrimage, not a destination. More of a pilgrimage than a set of beliefs. I think that one vital way to be beloved community is to care more about each other's stories than each other's opinions. In that spirit, I welcome you to join me afterwards to share something of your pilgrimages and welcome the stories of others along the spectrum of belief and unbelief. Thank you.